Thank you for welcoming an Aussie to your forum. And I'll talk a little bit more about how Bob and I work together a bit later on, but I do appreciate this man, and I appreciate you all being here today. It's an important day, and they've been important topics. And my topic is really important as well. Important, but often taboo. And important because it affects so many people. Taboo because no one really likes to speak about it. But the centre that I lead in Australia is, as Bob said, the Centre for Human Dignity. It comes under the auspices of the Australian Christian Lobby. And my topic today is in regards to pornography. So it's fairly obvious, I would think, as to why, I'll just move that on. Fairly obvious, I guess, why the Centre for Human Dignity would have something to say about this topic. Because pornography is the absolute antithesis of dignity. In fact, a worldview that accepts pornography, I would say to you, cannot coexist with an understanding of human dignity. My husband and I have 3 married children, and we have 10 grandchildren. Walt mentioned the power of a grandma, and I would really hope that I'm one of those powerful grandmas in my grandchildren's lives. But we desperately want to impart to our grandchildren the values of dignity, the values of humanity, the value that God created them in His image, and they have an amazing plan for each of their lives. We want to impart that into our grandchildren's lives. We want them to flourish and to thrive. But we don't believe that it's just for our grandchildren. This is something that is important for all humanity, and that's what God calls His children to actually speak into. But there is a massive problem, and we have a massive problem in Australia, and I believe also here in New Zealand. Pornography has created a global health crisis that affects each and every one of us. And I want to elaborate on this, but can I frame the talk with just these points that are up there at the moment? And I want you to carefully consider them as I just read through. The objectification of women in pornography is essential to the commercial success of the product. The message that women love being degraded, hurt, injured and insulted is the crucial message that pornography communicates to its predominantly male audience. Inevitably, this message is reshaping our understanding of sexuality, and particularly for our young people. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that everybody here today values freedom, values we are committed to that value. The opposite of freedom is captivity, slavery and bondage, and sexual exploitation in all of its forms are that thing that enslaves people. It is the opposite of freedom. But pornography, I would say to you, is actually at the heart of sexual exploitation. Truth has been mentioned a lot today by a number of the speakers, and the Bible tells us that it's truth that actually sets people free. The converse is then true, that there is no true freedom to be found in a lie. And so it is truth that we seek today, and I would say to you, however unpalatable that truth may be. It may shock you then to hear that reliable research would tell us that 60% of men in churches are viewing pornography. Perhaps not regularly, but they are viewing pornography. The issue of porn is a huge log in the church's eye, and we often want to pull a speck out of the world's eye, and a huge log is in our own eye. And I believe that we have to face up to this truth. It is a reliable truth that as many men in churches are watching porn as outside churches. The main difference is that the men in church are experiencing much guilt. And I'm sure this is because instinctively we know that porn use is not how God wants us to experience the good gift of sex that He has given us. But shame and guilt are not what God wants us to live with. God wants us to be free. And I'm not here today to put any shame or guilt on anybody, quite the opposite. I believe so strongly in redemption and believe so strongly that God can redeem us from all shame and guilt. But to be free, however, we must be prepared to speak and hear truth. And sometimes that shines a spotlight on places that we don't want it to be. Jesus Christ in His famous Sermon on the Mount said that lusting after a woman is the same as committing adultery with her. Now, I've not heard any Christian leader ever condone the act of adultery, but I have heard some play down the seriousness of pornography. And Jesus didn't do that. Jesus actually equated lusting after a woman with adultery. But I've heard Christian leaders use the boys will be boys line, perhaps not even voicing it, but their reactions and behaviour sometimes give them away, and it's not good enough, and the church has to face up to this. This is an important consideration because viewing pornography starts out, I would say to you, as a moral problem, but it very quickly becomes a brain problem. Pornography viewing actually affects the user's brain and subsequent behaviour. There are renowned psychologists that explain in detail how pornography affects the brain in the same way as heroin and leads to similar addictive behaviours. And I'm not going to go into the whole brain thing today, but suffice to say that in 2014, a Cambridge University study found that pornography triggers brain activity in sex addicts in the same way drugs trigger drug addicts. Researchers from the Human Development Centre in Berlin published findings recently that indicate watching pornography is associated with decreases in grey matter volume in a particular region of the brain known to process motivation. There is absolutely no doubt in any researchers or academics who look into this that pornography affects our brains. But what we have to realise, I think, right behind all of this is that there is a huge financial incentive for getting users hooked. So there's a huge financial incentive for using that problem with the brain to get hooked on pornography. Pornography is an industry. It is an industry that is based on the exploitation of girls and women worldwide, but it's also a very lucrative industry, currently worth an estimated $100 billion globally. And if I can put that into perspective, that's more revenue than Microsoft. It's about twice the combined revenue of Google, eBay, Yahoo and Netflix combined. Pornography accounts, if you can listen to this and get this into your brain somehow, it's hard to imagine, but pornography accounts for around 35% of all internet downloads. This is a really lucrative business. In 2016, the analytics report of just one popular pornography website, which is Pornhub, revealed that its videos were watched 92 billion times in the 1 year by 64 million daily visitors. We are in a global health crisis that is pornography. It is increasingly being seen around the world as a public health issue, but it is an especially challenging health issue as unlike cigarettes or illegal drugs or even unhealthy foods, online pornography is available free and it's available around the clock. And it's accessible by just a few clicks of any of your devices that you have to pay a fine to Bob for if it goes off today. A 2017 global survey, you can see it on the screen now, found that 1 in 6 people admit to having used public Wi-Fi to watch adult content. This is something that we're looking at doing with the centre. We run a number of campaigns, and one of the campaigns we've been trying to do is we're going ourselves into public spaces and we're trying to access pornography where the children would go after school, for instance. So if I go into the Brisbane Queen Street Mall, I cannot access pornography. It tells me that this is adult content, it's been blocked. If I walk into David Jones, however, and got onto their Wi-Fi, I can. If I go to any of the public libraries in Ipswich in Queensland, I can go straight onto any pornography website that I want to. And it's an interesting experiment to do, but you have to be really up to being able to even do it. And for instance, I wouldn't ask my husband to go into the Queen Street Mall and try and log on to Pornhub, you know. So I've got a couple of older women who do it with me, but we are working on a campaign to ask all Australian public spaces to actually make them safe for our children. Yeah. And there's nobody who won't agree with that, but it's still surprisingly hard to get legislators to actually do it. This is the first generation that has 24/7 access to pornography. And so back in 2007, the internet safety sort of site, McAfee, that you would all have pop-ups from them every now and then, they said that back in 2007, there was a 1 in 14 chance of a child typing in a misspelled URL and stumbling upon a porn site by accident. That's what they said. And imagine it by now. But can I say to you that it is not an accident when a child types in a misspelled URL and they stumble upon a porn site, because the porn industry, the $100 billion industry, knows how our children will misspell things, and they know already the type of misspelled words that will go in, and they are directing them to pornography websites. websites. And not only just soft porn, as some people would say it, but our children are accidentally, in their minds, stumbling across hardcore pornography that for some children will change the trajectory of their lives in an instant. Imagine what it would be like now, this was 2007. The average age of exposure to pornography is 11, and that age is continuing to fall with more kids learning how to use phones, tablets and computers at earlier ages. We all know what it's like. Our 4-year-old grandson was in our home last year, and I laughed hilariously because he walked up to our TV and he tried to change the channel by swiping it. And I said to him, "No, darling, that's a TV, that's not a screen." And so they know, like, he's 4 years old and he knows how to swipe and get to something different. In a recent survey done in the US, there were 90% of boys with an average age of 14 who are being found to consume pornography, to choose to, with a third of those boys doing it at least once a month. I read just a recent story written by a 13-year-old boy, and I wept as I read it. He had been exposed to pornography in his home as a small child and he'd grown up watching it. And he said this was the quote that made me cry. He said, "I feel I have no childhood now." Largely because of the availability of hardcore pornography and all that goes along with it, internet safety is now the 4th top ranked issue in the list of health concerns for children in the United States. 4th top health concern. And I say all that goes with it because, you know, with all that is happening with the pornography thing, because of the statistics like that, boys who consume pornography are now found to agree with the idea that it is acceptable to hold a girl down and force her to have intercourse, because that's what they're seeing from 11 years of age. So they actually grow up believing that that's normal and acceptable. Now, this is a copy of our research document. I do have a couple of hundred of these here today, and you're very welcome to take one. It is not a coffee table book. There are no explicit images in there, I can absolutely guarantee you that. But it is research that is thorough, and so therefore it is distressing. And it's not something that you would leave around for children to read. But it is important. And we are getting that into as many members of Parliament's offices as we can. We're getting it into Director General's offices for education and health. And we are trying to actually change the culture around the understanding of what pornography is actually doing to particularly our children. It has been really well received globally. And as I say, please feel free to take a copy today. I had the opportunity to go with Bob to Washington, DC earlier in the year to the Global Summit Against Sexual Exploitation, and I was able to present it there, and it was really well accepted. And following on from that, I was asked whether it could be included in an academic journal in the UK. So we're really pleased that this is actually getting out there, and it is gaining traction because it is becoming something that academics worldwide are understanding. It outlines in this book some of the harms, the health harms that we are seeing in pornography, and so I'm just going to go through some of them now. Some of the harms are just listed up there in dot point: safety risks to women, negative impact on the sexual health of adolescents, the normalisation of sexual attraction for minors, that's a really big one, rising levels of child-on-child sexual assault, power imbalance glamorised between men and women, and erectile dysfunction in men in their teens and 20s is now massive, and that is a quote from a health journal as well. If anybody wants these slides, I'm very happy to give them to Bob. You can get the slides off Bob, that's not a problem. So let's just look at a few of these issues more closely. So domestic violence against women. So research and experience, and I think if you just think logically, it shows an irrefutable correlation between pornography, rape and violence against women. The perpetrators in pornography are overwhelmingly male, and the target of aggression is overwhelmingly female. So if I can be precise, around 95% of the aggressive acts shown in pornography are committed against women. Now, not everyone, can I say and can I stress, not everyone who consumes sexually explicit material is going to go on to sexually offend. I don't believe that at all. However, an overwhelming number of empirical studies have found significant correlation between the consumption of sexually explicit media and sexual abuse, which in scientific literature I think has rendered pornography instrumentally causal in the etiology of sex offending, and that's That is something that is becoming globally accepted. Now again, I'm not proposing that everyone who watches violent porn is going to turn violent, but it is very clear that porn is not harmless. The multi-billion-dollar porn industry has a vested interest in making us believe that it is harmless. That's what they want us to believe. But this is a blatant lie. And at the start I said that we're looking at truth and we need to actually say this is a lie. Porn is not harmless. Pornography is a teacher. And it's teaching our children at younger and younger ages. It is a teacher, and its lesson is that women enjoy sexual violence and degradation. About 88% of pornography scenes contain physical violence, and women are actually depicted as enjoying it. So this is part of the lie. Around 50% of porn scenes contain verbal aggression, and by that I mean awful and degrading name-calling. Now, when I say all this, this has come from a very strong research background. But can I say to you that I've never actually watched porn myself, and I've never chosen to see it. I have seen it, but I have never chosen to see it, and I've never sat down and watched it. And I don't believe the lie that you have to watch something and see something to know that it's bad. Don't think the lie that you've got to go to a movie to see whether it's bad when you already know that the storyline's not going to be good and there's going to be gratuitous sex or something in it, but you need to see it so that you can tell others. I just think we trick ourselves into these lies. You don't have to eat rat poison to know that rat poison is bad for you. I don't recommend it. Like, rat poison is bad, don't eat it. And porn is bad, don't go there. So I was shocked. It actually takes a lot to shock me these days, but I was shocked by this because on my news feed it came up with a story of the husband murdering his wife, and the advertisement banner on the story was of 50 Shades of Grey. So the story was about a husband who obviously was using his strength to kill his wife. And we're talking then about a story that glamorises male dominance and female subservience. It's idiotic. It's just idiotic. In the last few years, there have been significant resources that have been devoted to changing attitudes towards domestic violence, particularly in my country. I'm not sure about yours, but numbers are not going down. We're spending a lot of money trying to change domestic violence attitudes, and numbers are not going down. In Australia, we have a Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence, and the director there, Di McLeod, she points the finger of blame for the increase in domestic violence directly at pornography. Di is not a woman of faith, but she's a good friend and she's an amazing woman and she's doing an amazing work. But in the past 5 years, her centre alone has seen a 56% increase in referrals from their hospital emergency department. She's stated publicly, and you can Google and find this, that the level of physical and sexual violence they are seeing inflicted on the women sent to them includes behaviour that would meet the criminal code definition of torture. And that the Gold Coast domestic violence crisis is being driven by abusers who are consumed by pornography, which depicts these harmful behaviours. The thing is that viewing this type of dehumanising content not only normalises dominance and abuse, but it diabolically connects that abuse to acts of love and intimacy. This can only lead then to women accepting the violence and aggression, because somehow in their minds this aggression is related to love and affection. It's a lie from the pit. There is consistent and reliable evidence to support the theory that male sexual aggression against women is related to exposure to or consumption of pornography. And these findings are reliable for exposure to non-violent and violent pornography. Of course, associations like that are more high amongst frequent users than those who just view it sporadically. Men are the main users of pornography. And I would say to you that as a woman, I find the whole concept of pornography degrading. But men pay a high price for this as well. And my heart goes out to men. We have a son, and I from a very young age, I felt so angry that as I pushed his stroller through a shopping centre, I believed that he was being groomed to have an appetite for porn from his stroller. and I would do everything I could to protect him from the images that were on shopfront windows. And I'm not actually a prude. I'm not talking about you can't have togs up on a tog shop, or you can't have lingerie up on a lingerie shop. But I think you understand what I mean when we have pornified those places to a degree that they are now pornography on our shopfront windows. God makes it clear that we would actually pay a high price for sexual sin. In 1 Corinthians 18, he says, "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body." And it should be no surprise then that exposure to sexually explicit material is correlated with all those things that I've put up there. Social anxiety, depression, low motivation, all of those things. It should be no surprise to us, because in the Bible it tells us that these sins will affect our own bodies. Depression is a big side effect of pornography watching. Studies have shown that pornography compounds the feelings of social isolation and increases antisocial behaviour. It increases insecurity in both girls and boys for different reasons. Adolescents who consume porn are more likely to demonstrate clinical symptoms of depression and even to be convicted of criminal behaviour. Men's exposure to sexually explicit material is correlated with a number of indicators related to depression, including all those things that I put before. And one of those biggies is erectile dysfunction. Now, in the past, erectile dysfunction was a problem mainly for men in their 40s and 50s, and they had underlying health concerns such as cardiovascular disease, there was diabetes or prostate issues. There were issues and there were reasons why. But the global problem of erectile dysfunction affecting men now in their teens has escalated in the past decade, and experts say that the problem is now massive. According to a leading medical therapist from Britain's Nottingham University Hospital, he says there are now as many men experiencing erectile dysfunction in their 20s as there are later in life. It's about a 50-50 split. And the cause, he would say, is the tidal wave of readily available online porn and the demands that it is placing on the younger generation. Men are paying a high price for our obsession with pornography. Closely related to depression is loneliness, and research shows that the more someone uses porn, the more lonely they become. Because users find it difficult to relate to people, they find it difficult to have a relation with a real person in a real relationship, and so they tend to withdraw from relationships, they become secretive, they experience less intimacy and increasing loneliness. And some would say, well, is loneliness a health risk? Well, it actually is, and our doctors would actually confirm this. Medical people say that loneliness can cause all sorts of levels of stress hormones, which can cause blood pressure, cholesterol levels rising, depression, cognitive abilities decreased, dementia, and even suicide attempts. Perhaps the hardest one for me to actually talk about, child exploitation. And so, as a grandmother, again, as a mother and a grandmother, it breaks my heart and it's hard to think about, but we actually must. Studies have shown that pornography desensitises the viewer, putting them at a really very high risk of wanting more and more and harder and worse, if that makes sense, and for developing some sort of sexual deviancy. This can mean that they can seek out more and more obscene pornography, including the sickening exploitation of children. So there was a meta-analysis done of 46 published studies, and this was conducted to look at the effects of pornography on sexual deviancy, so if I can just talk to that. And they also included attitudes regarding intimate relationships and attitudes regarding the rape myth. Now, of the major factors considered which can lead to sexual deviancy, exposure to pornography was found to contribute directly to the development of sexually dysfunctional attitudes and behaviour. So the results right across that 46 report, the meta-analysis, was consistent, and it basically said that exposure to pornographic materials puts one at increased risk for developing sexually deviant tendencies and committing sexual offences. It's obvious then, and it's certainly obvious to the people working in this space, that exposure to pornography and the consumption of pornography is linked with paedophilic activity. Pornography has been found to distort beliefs concerning sexually abusive acts with children and directly instigate sexual assaults as people act out what they have seen on the screen. And it doesn't impact only on child behaviour, on adult behaviour, because I said before, there's been a huge increase of child-on-child sexual assault. It's increasing at a massive pace and occurring at rates we have never seen before. And this is also attributed to kids acting out what they have seen. And when you relate that to the average age of exposure to pornography for the first time is 11, you can see how incredibly formational that is at a time, at an age where you are just growing into puberty. Now, child pornography itself has exploded in the past decade. The experts would say that child pornography has increased by 233% in the decade. Around a third of the online searches for pornography, so I've already said that about 35% of internet downloads is for pornography. Around a third of online searches for pornography is for teen porn. More than 30% of the searches conducted in peer-to-peer networks are related to child sexual abuse. This is a terrible evil, ladies and gentlemen. This is a terrible evil. Now, Task Force Argos is, and that's the picture up there at the moment, they're a globally recognised police force. They're actually based in Queensland, but they do work globally. And the men and women on this task force are just amazing. But they are in this job, they understand the true horror that is being faced by countless children every day. Children with no names. Devastatingly, no country in the world is immune from those who would sexually exploit our children through child pornography. Globally, we are fighting again against a very lucrative market. This is dollars, this is money, and it is looking for increasingly deviant porn. Some of the examples, I've had the Task Force Argos speak at conferences, and I meet with them just to keep up to date with what's happening so that I can know how we can react with the centre. And just recently they told me that some of the issues that they were dealing with at the time was that there's a father who sends photos of his daughter to a pedophile website in Russia. There's a father making sexually explicit comments about his own children to other child sex offenders online. Sometimes you have to do that to be able to get into a group, to get into a ring. The abuse of a little girl, 7 years old, who was sold by her uncle for $300 American. And then there's the case just recently of a child pornography website that was actually located in Belarus, but Argos took it down. The operation, and I only know this from an Australian point of view because that's where I was interested in, the operation that was taken down saw the arrest of 154 Australians. 57 of those lived in Queensland, where I live, and the officers of Argos identified 7 children in Brisbane. So that's why I wanted to break it down to know where I live. There were 7 children involved in this pedophile ring that was located in Belarus. The Argos team rescue many children, but it is a race against time, and can I say to you that it is a race we are losing. There are unknown victims in the millions. As a team, Argos tell me that they find one child almost every day. They've actually partnered with Microsoft to develop a victim image library, and this resource helps them identify children at risk, but it also horrifies them because it continues to grow. So they are seeing around 20,000 new child exploitation images appearing on the internet every week. So every week they are adding 20,000 new children to their library. So these aren't children that have been abused over and over again, these are new images, a child. The huge majority of these children are never found. They're never identified. The thought of children being exploited in this way is simply diabolical. But there is no such thing as good or okay pornography. So we would all be absolutely horrified at the idea of children being exploited in that way, but there is no thing as harmless pornography. Don't let anyone you know continue to believe the lie that pornography is harmless. Challenge it. If you need to challenge it in your own life, challenge it in your own life. But if you hear it being said, we need to challenge that, because there is no such thing as good pornography. It harms the user and the used. And it actually harms every single one of us. Me as someone who has never watched pornography. It harms me because it means that I am living in a porn culture. And I am living in a culture that accepts female subordination, it accepts male dominance, and it accepts females being able to be abused for entertainment. So I am living in a society that accepts that and sees that as something that is normal. I hope you see that that actually affects every single one of us. It is not human flourishing and is certainly not what God intended for humanity. Jesus told his followers that they have a responsibility to affect the culture. He said to us that we are to be salt and light. And so that affects our own lives, but it affects the lives of our church friends, it affects the lives of our workplaces. And looking at the big picture, I believe that it has to affect our governments. It has to mean that we affect our governments to recognise pornography as a health issue. And it's not impossible. It's imperative, actually, for our society to flourish. And I also wonder whether there's a tipping point in this, as we've talked a tipping point in the gender stuff, because it is becoming a very real health issue globally. Once upon a time, when I was at school, smoking was seen as just the normal thing to do. You walked onto the school bus and you could barely see the back of the bus. If I flew over to New Zealand on a plane, I would have had people smoking in front of me or behind me. If I went on a train, I could have gone. And the younger people here would just almost find that hard to believe. But that's what it was. We recognised smoking as a health issue, and when we recognised it as a health issue, governments started putting things in place to actually restrict our ability to smoke. They put taxes on, and we've already heard that from your MP this morning. So no smoking was ever seen as helpful. We didn't actually put out a big ban on smoking, but no smoking was seen as helpful. Whether you used a filter or not, there was no sort of level of, oh, this little bit is okay. It was just saying smoking is bad for you. And we also saw it as something that affected other people negatively. We recognised that passive smoking was also a risk. And I would say to you that just as smoking affects every single one who is in the vicinity, pornography affects everyone, not just the user. And this, again, I would say to you, is not about shaming. I am not here to shame anybody here today. This is about redemption. Because the standard that you walk past is the standard we accept. And we need to call out the evil of pornography. It's actually a really big ask. I know that it's a big ask. And I've even had death threats for some of the campaigns that I've run, which makes me actually smile. Doesn't make my husband smile, but I just think it's ridiculous because no one can touch me unless God allows them. So that doesn't actually worry me. But people get really uptight about this. And the reason they get uptight about it is because there's a lot of money involved in pornography. Can I say that's what they're uptight about? It is a really big job, and it is really hard to see cultural change, but we have already seen some remarkable achievements. So can I just share them briefly with you as I close? In 2015 and 16, we had a global campaign. This was from over in the States as well as here, and people like Melinda Tankard-Reist, all these people, we all worked together on this in this space. Big hotel chains such as Intercontinental, Holiday Inn, Crown Plaza, Sheraton, Hilton, Hyatt and Westin, all these big holiday hotel chains, they all removed pornography from their TV channels. So that was a great thing. In Australia, we have wicked campers that have incredibly awful pornographic slogans, and we now, in Queensland, in my state, we've been able to talk our Attorney-General into removing their registration if they drive in our state. So that's a great thing. Just very recently, Cosmopolitan and Snapchat. So Snapchat is one of the apps that our kids use a lot on their phone. I don't use it, but I know the kids do. So Cosmopolitan joined with Snapchat, and they launched an X-rated channel, and it was called Cosmo After Dark, and it was going live every Friday night. Now, kids use Snapchat. There's no sort of way that you can say, okay, you can use Snapchat, but don't go to this channel. They use Snapchat, so they're going to be exposed to it. But it was cancelled a day later because huge public outcry, and that was basically led by the states. But again, we all joined together. There's a global network forming, and Bob is part of that network. I'm part of that network. Melinda is part of that network. We've got a really good group going. In Australia, I started outdoor advertising should be G-rated right back in 2010, and we have seen some good. Good wins. We get billboards taken down. It takes too long. There are no penalties. It drives me mad because our pornified culture. We are grooming children from infancy to have an appetite for pornography. And not only that, but with our advertising and with the hyper-sexualised advertising that we are allowing, we actually are pressurising women and girls to conform to unrealistic and even dangerous standards of beauty. It just doesn't make sense what we're doing. Everybody knows that this is actually an unhealthy way and an unhealthy attitude, but we allow it to keep growing. So we fight on, and this must be challenged. But, at school at the moment, and we've talked a lot about the gender stuff at the moment, but at school we have the most horrendous stuff happening in Australia. I don't know whether you have this on your reading list. It's up there, The Perks of Being a Wallflower. If I started reading out of this book, Bob would pull me off the stage with a shepherd's hook. It is disgusting, and it is being read aloud in grade 10 classes in rural Queensland at the moment. And we seem powerless to get it stopped being read. And yet it is pornographic in its nature, and I wouldn't want to read it out loud to you. It's just so awful. But I'm happy for you to come and have a look at it later, and I've highlighted some of the bad stuff. We have the ABC Reading Eggs. I don't know whether you've got ABC Reading Eggs here, but it is a really excellent educational resource that has been used for many years. All of a sudden, now, ABC Reading Eggs, gender identity. So we have new thrust on gender stuff coming into our schools, even through some of our most respected educational things. And is gender related, is the whole gender thing related to pornography? Well, actually, I would argue with you, yes it is, because some of the explicit nature that we go into in some of the gender stuff, to me, is pornographic. In the guise of education, we are actually pornifying our children in schools. Now, across the Tasman, we saw a great win recently, and so this is another one of those wins. I just wanted to let you know that things are happening, and it's not all doom and gloom. We are actually making some traction. Roadshow Films, as the distributor of this film, Show Dogs, in Australia and New Zealand, they have actually re-edited their re-edit. So it came out in the US when we realised it was going to be launched here in Australia and New Zealand on the 5th of July. So is that today or is that tomorrow? So launched right now. It was a pornographic movie. Honestly, it was based for children. And I don't have time to go into the storyline, but you can look it up and you can Google all the furor over it, because there's been a huge furor. But after complaining about it, and Bob and I, having emails going back and forward, the Roadshow Films that sent this to me, they said they wish to advise that after reviewing both the original and subsequent revised US versions of the feature, so they had, even in the US, they did an edited version, they have decided to edit their own version of Show Dogs that completely omits all scenes in question. The Roadshow localised version of the film will be the only version of Show Dogs released in Australia and New Zealand cinemas. So that was really great. I still say don't go to the movie, because they shouldn't have made the movie in the first place. It's disgusting. Don't go to the movie, but I'm just so glad and grateful that there will be some children who are taken to this movie by parents who are completely unaware of the subplot that was in it, that will not be confronted with some of the stuff that was there. So I began with a verse from the Bible, the truth will set us free, and I'm just going to leave you with this other verse. 1 Peter 2:16 tells us to live as people who are free. So the truth will set us free, and then God says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Pornography is a secret sin, but it is one that affects each one of us, and I'd say to you it particularly affects our children. We need to shine a light into this dark place of pornography, not simply because of the effect it has on the user, but can you imagine with me that every single image represents a victim. Many children victims, which breaks our heart, but many, many women who are victims as well. I thank you for the opportunity to briefly lift the lid on it and to speak truth, but my prayer for myself and my prayer for you, I guess, is just that prayer that the psalmist said, "Create in me a clean heart, O Lord, and renew a right spirit in me." So, thank you.